How to make soft and buttery sourdough brioche with only 7 ingredients, and it's a fairly small size loaf as well. So to start with, I'm gonna place a pan on my scales and I'm gonna measure 80 grams of milk, which is basically 80 milliliters. And I'm using full fat milk or whole milk. And then I'm gonna add 70 grams of butter. The butter I use is baking butter, which is half price of normal butter in the UK, but you can actually use any butter you have available. Then I'm gonna place this pan with milk and butter on a hob and let it melt on a slow heat. Then in a separate bowl, we're gonna beat 2 eggs. So my eggs happen to be about medium size, I would say. And I want to beat those eggs fairly well. And I want to have that kind of smooth, even consistency rather than having little lumps there and there. It's just, it incorporates nicer into a dough. So once the eggs are well beaten, I'm gonna move to my next ingredient, and that would be 140 grams of sourdough starter. So my sourdough starter, it was nice and active and very bubbly, and I've done a flow test where you place a little bit of a sourdough starter in the water and it floated, which means it was nice and light. And so I'm gonna add 140 grams of sourdough starter. If you want to know how to make sourdough starter, I've got a separate video which I will link in the description below. So 140 grams of sourdough starter has been added, and then I'm gonna add 40 grams of sugar. Mine was just the normal sugar that I had in the cupboard. Then I'm gonna add a pinch of salt, which was just a tiny bit. And then I'm gonna add 350 grams of strong white bread flour. Now that the rest of the ingredients have been added into our bowl, I'm just going to mix it as well as I can while I'm waiting for butter to melt on a hob. I've checked and the butter has been melted, and I'm gonna add this into my dough. Just make sure you don't add super hot butter because that eventually could kill your sourdough starter that is already incorporated into the dough. Once I add the butter, you can notice that it's becoming more and more yellow. And also, as I'm mixing all the ingredients now together, the dough becomes a little bit more wet and fairly sticky. All that sugar has stickiness, which eventually we're going to become really smooth and buttery bread. Mix as much as you can. If you have a mixer, please do use the mixer. I don't have one, so I'm just mixing by hand. And as you can see, the more I mix, the more smooth and well incorporated the dough is. To be fair, I wasn't mixing for that long. It's only a few minutes. Do not worry about mixing a dough that it would be super smooth. As long as all ingredients are well incorporated, um, that's good enough start for this bread. So now the dough is ready. As you can see, it's nice and soft and very sticky, which is going to be so much fun to work with this dough. But the first stage is ready, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to cover this bowl and leave the dough relax for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, you can see there's loads of happening inside that bowl. And we're going to do our first stretch and fold. It is a good idea to get a cup or container with water to dip your hands in to help you to work with this sticky dough. So we're going to do our stretch and fold, where that means basically I'm lifting the dough up and folding back towards myself, and I'm turning the bowl around, and you kind of want to start with doing that on all four sides. You can do that as many times as you want. Sometimes, especially if it's a first stretch and fold, the dough won't allow you to do too much work with it because it's gonna start kind of tearing apart. Again, 4 folds would be more than enough, so don't worry if you can't do more than that. Already we can see that the dough is getting slightly more shinier and a little bit more smooth. It's looking actually pretty good. So the first stretch and fold is done, and we're going to cover the bowl again and leave it for another 30 minutes for dough to relax. Now we're going to go ahead and do our second stretch and fold. Exactly same thing what you just done in the first one. Again, you can see that the dough getting a little bit fuller, a little bit shinier, and a little bit more smooth. So I'm dipping my hands in the water, kind of moving the dough away from the bowl, and again I'm stretching it into the air and folding back towards myself into the center of the dough. I'm going to do that as many times as I can. I actually do enjoy doing stretch and folds, but like I said, sometimes dough start tearing apart, and when that happens, you know that you should not be doing more stretches and folds for the dough. Many recipes recommend quite few stretches and folds, but to be fair, I find that 2 are more than enough. So I'm kind of spinning the dough around the bowl just to make shape it a little bit more into a tight bowl. Again, we're gonna cover the bowl and leave it to rest for quite a few hours. So I let my sourdough brioche dough rest overnight, and when I came into my kitchen, to my surprise, um, it actually went bursting out of the bowl. The top of the dough got tiny bit dry, but that's all right. I just done a few more stretches and folds and was perfectly fine again. As you can see, I'm just gently moving dough away from the bowl, and you can see how well the dough was raised overnight. It has that tight net of little bubbles, little strings, which tells you that it's looking pretty good. So what just happened is called a bulk fermentation, which means we let the dough uh, proof. It's like the first proper proof, and we're gonna let the dough proof for quite a few hours. So I'm doing another stretch and fold, and it's more so to get as much air out of dough as possible. Then I'm kind of trying to again to create that tight bowl, but the dough is so sticky. So it's pretty difficult. The next step is to get a pan where you're actually going to bake your sourdough brioche, and we need to line this up with the baking paper. Baking paper, I usually get a baking paper sheet, run under a little bit of water, and then crunch it in my hands, and it's just easier to line up any sort of baking pan. So once that's ready, we're gonna push that a little bit aside, and then we're gonna start working on shaping that final shape for sourdough brioche. So this dough you can see in the bowl, I'm gonna get it out of the bowl and I'm gonna divide into 6 smaller size balls. Those balls gonna eventually placed in the pan, and once they raise into volume, they're gonna create that final beautiful kind of round little ball shape. So the dough, I'm gonna get a dough cutter and divide that in half at first, and each of those halves I'm gonna divide into 3 um, sort of similar size balls. I don't measure it then, I'm just cut them just by just looking at them. I know not all 3 on each side becomes really even a size or weight, but that doesn't matter. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna shape each piece of the dough now into as much as I can into small tight balls, dough balls. So again, it's a quite sticky dough, so you might want to have a little bit of water by side, and try to shape it as much as you can. Sometimes you can just push the ball down to the worktop with your fingers, and that creates a little bit tighter bottom. I also twist the bottom of the dough ball, and again, that just to create tighter bottom. So the first ball is in a pan, and I'm just gonna go and repeat the same thing on the rest of 5 pieces of dough. So I just fold these dough balls back. It's kind of like a stretch and folds, and I just twist the bottom, and they actually don't look that bad. If you if you're shaping these final dough balls and they don't happen to be in the right shape, or you're not happy with them, just stretch it out, try to knead a little bit, and then try to shape it again. Sometimes I just put them on a worktop and just pull them with my both hands towards myself, and again that creates tighter or creates a tension on the bottom. As you can see, they're not, those 3, they're not the same size, but again, it really doesn't matter. So what I wanted to mention is when I was initially learning or wanted to make sourdough brioche, all the recipes that I found online happened to be fairly big sizes. As I was making this brioche, I thought to myself, I don't want to waste these fairly expensive ingredients. So I wanted to create a smaller size loaf brioche. So what I did, I've calculated roughly what I would need for smaller size loaf, all the ingredients, and then I tested that a couple of times. It worked out really well, and this bread gets so many compliments. Like I said, soft, buttery, great for toast, and so many other. You can make a French toast as well. Unbelievable. There's just so many different things you can end up making from brioche. The next step is to let your sourdough dough to proof again, which is the is called final proofing. So for that, we need to cover the dough to make sure the top is not gonna dry. If the dough gets dry top, then it won't allow the dough to proof and raise in volume. So one side of the cling film I've decided to rub with butter, which actually worked out really well, and I was just an idea in a moment. So I rubbed as much as I can, which is not particularly easy. But then the buttered side of the cling film, I'm gonna cover it, the dough, and I let it sit and proof for quite a few hours. So it happened to be summertime, but it took me quite a few hours on the worktop for dough to actually get raised. So we also had to pop out. So I had to leave my dough in the fridge for about, I would say, 5 or 6 hours. But as you can see, it doubled in volume and it actually looks like it's bursting to get out of this pan. It looks pretty impressive. Where the dough was touching the cling film with butter happened to have even more bubbles because sourdough loves fat. Now, the very last step we need to do is to beat 1 egg, and we're going to use that to wash the top of sourdough dough before we actually get that into the oven for baking. Once the egg is beaten, I'm gonna use this brush for baking, and I'm gonna use the egg to go over the all both sides of the sourdough brioche. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as you kind of brush it. Try not to leave too much egg in the gaps between the balls. Um, we don't want scrambled eggs in the middle of sourdough brioche. Yeah, but it's just the gentle strokes to make sure we're covering. It's gonna give a little glaze and it's gonna have a little shininess to the breads. Now let's go and bake this bread for 30 minutes. The bread is finally done. So before we're gonna start cutting the bread, I let it cool down for quite a few hours. In fact, I always find that sourdough breads taste better the next day. I feel like the sourdough needs a proper time to cool down and let the bread kind of get a little bit drier because there's just so much moisture in sourdough. So I want to cut this bread and show you how it looks inside. It's so easy to cut brioche because it's so light. As you can see, it has an amazing texture. Very light, loads of bubbles. We have a couple of big bubbles, but personally, I don't like those big bubbles too much. I like those tiny bubbles kind of spread consistently. And look how soft it is. It's falling apart. Can you imagine having a piece of this bread with butter or honey? It's so delicious. Thank you for watching.